is an on-the-record call webinar where we're going to discuss some topics surrounding upcoming summer warm weather trends, the transition from El Niño to La Niña, and natural disasters in our natural climate. We will offer questions at the end, and you can use the raise your hand feature, and our operator will allow you to ask those questions to one of the experts here today. Moving forward, I'll hand it off to Steve to introduce our speakers, and we can get started.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Milloy. I publish junkscience.com. You can get me on X at junkscience. I'm joined today by Greg Wrightstone, who's Executive Director of the CO2 Coalition, and James Taylor, who is President of the Heartland Institute. And we are going to be talking briefly this morning and taking your questions about upcoming weather and wildfires and some other climate-related issues that might give you some ideas for stories, hopefully in the near future. So without further ado, Greg.
Thank you very much, Steve. Summer is now approaching, and summer is the favorite time for climate alarmists to advance their linkage between so-called man-made climate change and severe weather-related issues that we find, like fires, hurricanes, tornadoes. But we're looking at the science, the facts, and the data. It doesn't support this idea of increasing severe weather events. In fact, in terms of actual numbers, the science leads us to, in many cases, there's a decline. I'm going to share my screen here. I've just got a few slides that we'll look at here. First, we see here that we all agree, the three of us, that we're in a warming trend. Of course we are. But the key here is that it began warming more than 300 years ago, long before we started adding CO2 to the atmosphere. This is a chart of the longest thermometer-based temperature record compared to CO2. Again, with the difference increase in the y-axis, comparing temperature to CO2. And then a little bit longer view of the last 1,000 years, showing the last warming trend that was very similar to our own, but a little bit warmer, showing it occurred at an area at a time of very low CO2. According to the International Disaster Database, we've seen a decline of reported natural disasters of about 10% since the year 2000, when they built out the entire database. Importantly, too, we're being told that deaths from severe weather-related events are increasing. The science, the facts, and the data say just the opposite. We've had a significant, more than 90% decline in global deaths from natural disasters dating back to the beginning of the last century, more than 100 years ago. One of the big things you'll hear as we get into hurricane season is that hurricanes are being driven, both the intensity and numbers, by man-made warming. The data, again, does not support this. One of the best records we have of hurricanes for the United States are those that make landfall. This is a chart of the major landfalling hurricanes by decade, showing no increase. If we look at Florida, as I'm calling you from Florida today, this is one of the most at-risk states in the United States. This is the landfalling hurricane frequency of Florida, going back to 1850. Again, showing actually a slight decline. One of the big things by August, September, we get into fire season, is a claim of increasing fires related to man-made warming. This is a chart you might see, and probably will see, from the fourth National Climate Assessment, showing an increase in acres burned. What they don't tell you is the entire database, that this data that you will be shown from the fourth climate assessment was cherry-picked out of a larger database, showing that today fires, both in area and number, 20% of what they were 80 and 90 years ago. We're also being told the droughts, you'll hear that, the droughts are increasing because of our activities. Global analysis of droughts show them to be in significant decline. One of the biggest advantages we have, we are in a warming trend, as we say. We see that there's an increase in growing season. Growing season has increased by 2 weeks since 1900, and agricultural productivity is benefiting from modest warming and more CO2. or you will also hear of heat waves and heat-related deaths increasing. The science tells us differently. 15 to 20 times as many people die due to cold as to heat. So I would say that go to the science, the facts, and the data to learn more about this, and you'll see that in fact there is no climate crisis, and by almost every metric, our ecosystems are thriving and prospering, and the human condition is improving.
Okay, thank you very much, Greg. That was terrific. We can all go home now, except James has even more interesting things to say.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's important to keep in mind that as we look at warm temperatures that currently exist, we are currently experiencing the second longest and the third strongest El Niño ever recorded. That means global temperatures should be higher. They should be significantly higher than is normally the case. And that is indeed the case, but it also illustrates how there is no climate crisis. First of all, for context, we being the planet, Earth is still recovering from the Little Ice Age, which was the coldest period of the past 10,000 years, and that ended about 150 years ago. Temperatures should continue to set quote-unquote records so long as climate activists define the record as the past 150 years or so. We're recovering from the Little Ice Age. However, throughout most of the time period that human civilization has existed, temperatures have been significantly warmer than today, and humans and nature fared just fine. So we're warming from a very cold period, but we're still unusually cool, not unusually warm. And let me just quickly show you a little illustration of this. So what you see here is a chart. This is produced by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's cut and pasted directly from their very first climate assessment report. If you look at the middle chart, this is what the United Nations reports temperatures of the past 10,000 years. At the far right, those are temperatures today. That last little small squiggly line that goes up just a little bit, that's all of the warming of the past 150 years. So when we hear the temperatures are the hottest ever recorded, yeah, if you define the record as 150 years. But we know the temperatures are unusually cool right now, not unusually warm, even in a dramatic El Niño summer. We'd have to keep warming at present pace for another couple centuries to get to temperatures that are even normal. So don't buy the hype about some unusual records or extreme heat going on. Now that's context, also impact. Greg mentioned much of this, but a few things I'd like to point out. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reports that with the lone exception of October 1983, March 2024 was the month that saw the smallest percentage of the country experiencing very dry conditions ever recorded. Going back over 100 years, 100 plus years, right now, we're at the second smallest percentage of the country ever experiencing drought conditions. Now, America is a large country. The Earth is a large place. There are still some areas in drought. Even today, you can, if you do an internet search for drought, you'll see reports of one small area of the country or another experiencing drought, and they'll blame climate change. But we know that as temperatures are moderately warming, drought is becoming less and less frequent and less severe. We have to look at the overall trends. The same thing is true, for example, hurricanes, as Greg noted, and really for just about every category of extreme weather event. As the planet continues its gradual recovery from the Little Ice Age, virtually all extreme weather events are showing no trend or are becoming less frequent and severe. Outlier extreme weather events do not make a trend. As I mentioned before, there'll be a place that experiences drought. That doesn't mean drought is increasing. Remember that the planet is a large place. The fact that extreme weather events still occur does not mean that climate change or a gradually warming planet is causing them. Look at the trends, and the trends all show that things are not getting worse as far as extreme weather events go. And one final note here. Every phase of the climate cycle has patterns. So, for example, every phase of the El Niño, La Niña climate cycle has patterns. We've been in this El Niño, as I mentioned, it's the second longest and third strongest ever recorded. With an El Niño, you get certain weather impacts. When we inevitably switch to neutral or La Niña conditions, then there'll be different impacts. When climate activists see this, they talk about climate change whiplash. If we go from a period of one area of the country or the planet experiencing drier conditions and they get to wetter conditions, they talk about climate change whiplash. It's not climate change whiplash. It's the El Nino La Nina cycle. And it's important to remember, again, regardless of what occurs during an El Nino or La Nina for places getting more drought, less drought, whatever the factor is, still the overall long-term trend as temperatures warm is such extreme events are becoming less frequent and less severe. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Okay, thank you, James. That was great. Can I have my slides, please? Okay, so I'm just going to quickly go over some current events that I think are noteworthy. First slide, please. So, the climate con is that every emission causes warming. I find it interesting that for April 2024, it was actually 1 1/3 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than April 1981, despite 43 years worth of emissions, probably a doubling in urban heat island effect. There's just what's the explanation for that if emissions drive warming? I think more people need to consider, that question. Next slide, please. There's some interesting litigation going on around climate. Just last week, the Ninth Circuit, which is the most left circuit of all U.S. appellate jurisdictions, for the second time, rejected the so-called kids climate lawsuit, the Juliana lawsuit. It's being sponsored by something called Our Children's Trust. We are led to believe that these are children suing about climate. In fact, it is just adults hiding behind children. We have witnessed over the last 20 years children being brainwashed to an unprecedented extent about climate. And I guess adults have found some of them who are, they can hide behind in these lawsuits. The Ninth Circuit, for the second time, ruled that climate is a political decision and it is not something that children can sue about. The other case that is important, the Supreme Court will soon be deciding whether to take up the case of Sunoco versus Honolulu, or actually it's probably Honolulu versus Sunoco, but Sunoco is asking for the writ of certiorari. Honolulu, who has sued Big Oil over climate, claiming, amongst other things, that emissions are a nuisance, and they want to Big Oil in state court. So Big Oil has requested the Supreme Court look at this and say that if they're going to sue, it's got to be in federal court. So that's an upcoming decision that you might want to pay attention to. Next slide, please. Okay, so EVs are not doing well. Everyone knows that. Sales are down. Car companies are losing money. Consumers don't really want these things. Just last week, the Biden administration narrowed the number of EVs that are eligible for the $7,500 subsidy. If the EV is largely dependent on China, it's not eligible for a subsidy. I'd like to point out a recent report by one of our sister groups, Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, on processed graphite. All EV batteries are dependent on processed graphite from China. All processed graphite comes from there. So, if we're talking about, components that are dependent on China, no EVs should really be eligible for taxpayer subsidies. And this is a story that really has not been widely reported. People talked about cobalt, for example, but no one has talked about the processed graphite, which goes into every EV battery. Next slide, please. There's also developments going on with whales. We know that since the Biden administration has permitted development of offshore wind, dozens of whales have been washing up dead on shore, could be related to the wind development. We have several groups that have sued the Biden administration over this. Heartland is one of them. Committee for Constructive Tomorrow and the National Legal Policy Center filed suit in March to stop Dominion Energy, which is in Virginia, from developing what is planned to be the largest offshore wind development in the U.S. They're in the middle of some early litigation right now. This lawsuit has uncovered the fact that Dominion has not acquired all the permits it needed to begin development, and so the judge has delayed Dominion from starting the development of its offshore farm. So this litigation is ongoing, something you want to pay attention to. Next slide, please. Okay, and there's net zero. Net zero is not doing well. Net zero is the notion that there will be essentially no CO2 emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere by 2050. Of course, this is a crazy idea. I have given you 6 words there that describe net zero: impossible, unaffordable, undesirable, pointless, suicidal, genocidal even. Everything we do in our world depends on fossil fuels. We cannot do without fossil fuels. Scotland has had to give up its net zero goals because they're just impossible. Germany, where net zero is struggling, not doing well at all either, they decided that they're going to raise airline costs, airline taxes, in order to get people to reduce flying to meet their net zero goals. Of course, this is not going to work. People are just going to be paying more to travel, and net zero will not be achieved. Next. And so that's the end. Those are some current developments that I hope you all pay attention to. Mark, let's take some questions.
Yes, hello. This is Catherine Salgado. I'm with PJ Media. And one thing that when we're talking about, say, green energy, for instance, which of course is a big push right now, it seems as if one of the problems with green energy is that it's taking up a lot of land. In other words, a lot of nature that otherwise would not be either marred by green energy or that could be used for things like farming. So it seems to be totally counterproductive to the environmental mindset. Do you have anything that you could say about that in terms of how to explain to people why green energy not only is expensive and depends on materials from places like China, but also could be disastrous in terms of how much land it takes up?
Yeah, Catherine, that's a great question. Scientists at Harvard University, who, by the way, noted that they believe in a climate crisis, they decided to find out how much of our nation's land would be required to switch over from today's conventional energy mix to an electricity grid powered entirely by wind power. What they found is that we would have to cover literally 1/3 of the entire American landmass with wind turbines to replace conventional electricity generation. And by the way, if we electrify vehicles, which of course is the big push from the Biden administration and climate activists, that would then have to be literally 1/2 of our landmass covered by wind turbines. Now, boy, when I was younger, being an environmentalist meant primarily that you were a conservationist, that you wanted to preserve the natural lay of the land, especially protecting ecosystems from development. If we were to switch over to this green energy transition, we would be looking at the single greatest environmental catastrophe that has ever occurred. I cannot imagine what would happen if we lost 1/3 to 1/2 of our forests, 1/3 to 1/2 of our open plains, 1/3 to 1/2 of our ecosystems. And that's just the land use. That's not even counting the number of birds and bats that get destroyed by wind turbines each and every year, even now when there's just a small percentage of our energy provided by wind turbines. So it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about environmentalism, climate change is not the only factor. It shouldn't even be a large factor. In fact, it shouldn't even be any factor considering the science. But yes, we have to consider all aspects, all environmental aspects of competing energy sources.
And Catherine, I'll jump in here and just remind you that the United Nations report on biodiversity concluded correctly that the greatest threat to our endangered species is habitat loss. I agree with that. But what's their solution to solve a non-existent problem? It's to pave over tens of thousands of square miles of grassland, down mature forests, chop them up into wood pellets, send them to the United Kingdom and call it green energy. No, thank you. That's not, I'm not signing on to that. Neither is anyone else here. So their solution for a biodiversity and extinction problem is to pave over more grassland, more forests. It's completely contrary to a truly caring environmental policy.
And
Yeah,
Catherine,
and I'm just going to close out by saying that saving the planet now means destroying it. All these wind farms and solar farms. I mean, this is land that is essentially permanently destroyed. The concrete rebar foundations that go in for the solar panels and the wind turbines, how are those ever going to come out? Who's going to do that work? Who's going to pay for it? Are these things you can take down the turbines, but what are you going to do about the foundations? I mean, that farmland is ruined. Greg mentioned, maybe it was James, all the birds that are being killed. I mean, we are whacking out of the sky, and the government has permitted whacking out of the sky of endangered birds, all sorts of eagles, and now we're starting to do it offshore with wind. There's only 300 or so right whales, for example, that are thought to exist. The Biden administration has permitted the taking of more than twice as many as are thought to exist. So saving the environment now means destroying it.
And Catherine, if you'd like the study that I mentioned from the Harvard University scientists, I'd be happy to send it to you. My email is jtaylor@heartland.org.
I do have one question that I was messaged for you guys. A new poll shows that globally, 33% believe climate change is one of the world's three main challenges, but only 14% say fighting it should be among the top three priorities for their government. Yet the Biden administration's EPA is doing everything to kill America's fossil fuel industry by regulating them out of existence. What do you think this means for the American economy?
Well, if you look at competitive advantages, right now there are approximately 1,000 coal power plants that are in the stage of either permitting or construction. And the vast majority, almost everyone, is in Far East Asia, with some in Africa. And China and India are far and away leading the other nations for these new coal power plants. There's a reason why China, although it processes most of the materials for wind turbines and solar panels, and it manufactures most of the wind turbines and solar panels themselves, there's a reason why China doesn't actually use the wind turbines and solar panels and instead sells them to the West. It's because coal power, natural gas power, hydropower, nuclear power are all far more affordable, reliable than wind and solar power. So when we are hamstringing our economy by requiring wind and solar power, and the rest of the world understands that they're going to get a competitive advantage for their economies, not just a competitive advantage, but just an actual advantage when if their people have to pay less for energy costs, they have more money available for nutrition, for better housing, for better medication, et cetera. The rest of the world is going to fare far better than we are, and hopefully that's going to change soon.
I would say that right now, President Xi of China is rubbing his hands together in glee because we're embracing this crazy notion of economic suicide that they're promoting. He understands what electricity should be. It should be reliable, abundant, and affordable. Solar and wind are none of those. We can get that from nuclear, from natural gas, and from coal. And that's why President Xi and Prime Minister Modi of India mining as much coal as they can and using that to create electricity to lift their people out of generational poverty.
And I'll just make 2 points. First, we've been lied to decades about wind and solar. They do not lower electricity prices. There is no example any place in the world where wind and solar have lowered electricity prices. in places like India and China and other developing economies, they are building far more coal and natural gas where they can afford it, because wind and solar just don't cut it. They're expensive, they're unreliable, don't make any economic or practical sense. Second point, we've experienced a lot of inflation in this country under Joe Biden, and that was caused by, in large part, by his war on fossil fuels. He sent gas prices through the roof. He scared off the oil industry from production. He handed over control of the global price of oil to OPEC. Americans have paid the price for it. Really, everybody around the world has paid the price for it with incredible inflation we haven't seen in more than 40 years. So, this whole green agenda is crippling our economy. And, if we don't turn things around, it's going to get a lot worse.
Yeah, to amplify Steve's point, the Energy Information Administration reports that since January of 2021, there has been a 21% increase in wind and solar power on our electricity grid. At the same time, electricity prices since January 2021 have increased by 21%. It's not a coincidence. Leading up to 2021, we were getting about 1% per year in terms of increases in electricity prices, 1% per year. Now we're talking in 3 years, 21%. So that's a sevenfold increase by year, 3 years, 7% per year. And that's just, that's unnecessary. That's self-inflicted. And for people who say wind and solar power are less expensive, again, there's a reason why China and India and the rest of the world don't utilize wind and solar power, even though they're better situated than we are to do it. They know it's foolish. And we see in the real world, when we switch to wind and solar power, energy prices get more expensive. By the way, the states in America, and the exact numbers I don't have off the top of my head, but it's something like there are like 17 states that have more than 25% of their electricity coming from coal power. And all 17 have electricity prices below the national average. Again, that's not a coincidence. There's a reason for that. And by the way, off the top of my head, those numbers are accurate. I know that.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So one of the things that's getting fact checked a lot online right now by the powers that be is that, people point out one of the big arguments against the idea of climate catastrophe is that none of the major predictions of climate alarmists have ever come true. That's what a lot of people say, right? So obviously the fact checkers tie themselves into knots trying to contradict this. For instance, Meta AI is one of the latest ones that is trying to explain this away. Could you comment on that? Whether or not it's true that no major predictions have ever been fulfilled, and what that tells us about climate alarmism?
Well, I'll start off with that. So we've done a bunch of reports on this. I cannot think of a single apocalyptic climate predictions going back to the 1960s that has ever come true. We climate scientists, if climate science was a real science, and these guys actually understood it, they would actually be able to predict things. That is sort of the hallmark of science. When you understand something and can demonstrate it that scientifically, that what you predict comes true, and these guys just don't have that. They never have. And so what they tend to do is to make predictions that go way far out, which are not going to be cannot be verified by anybody alive. They're not really scientific because they're not capable of verification. Or they try to go back into the past and make claims about the past, which also is not scientific because they can't be verified. So climate science has really just come down to making unverifiable claims that only become true because they get repeated in the media and just become common knowledge by people that don't know any better. So I think it's really important that these people claim to be scientists, and if they really were scientists, they would be able to make predictions that we can verify that are true, and that just has not happened.
And one of the things driving these failed predictions is they're basing a lot of these forward-looking projections on climate models that we know for a fact over-predict warming significantly. If you look at the 100 plus models that are used, there's only one that has accurately predicted the temperature into the future compared to actual temperatures, and that's the Russian model. The others we see, an average, over-predict warming by 2.5 to 3 times too much. The scientific process, the scientific method requires that if your hypothesis is not borne out by evidence, that you need to reject it and come up with another, but they haven't. And if your salary and your paycheck depends on towing the company line on climate change, you will probably continue making these false projections into the future.
And here's my challenge. Have these climate activists identify specifically which of their asserted crises have come true.
Right.
I mean, which one specifically? And if it turns out to be wildfires or drought or whatever, whatever, name it. And here's what I'll often see in the media, for example. Let's say that there is a slate of wildfires in California. Well, there hasn't been in a few years here, but regardless, California traditionally has some dry places you get wildfires. And they'll say, I'll see the media story. Climate predictions have come true, as we see by these devastating, unprecedented wildfires in California, but they don't show any data to back that assertion up. What we do know is that NASA satellites have been measuring wildfires, the amount of land burned globally since 1998. So we're talking 25 years. And they show that there has been a substantial decrease in the amount of land burned by wildfires. Peer-reviewed studies going back looking at wildfires globally to the year 1900, over a century, show the same thing. There's been a decrease in wildfires as temperatures have warmed. Pointing to some anecdotal one-off event that defies the overall global trend does not prove your prediction. So again, my challenge is this: name the extreme weather events and show me the data, not an anecdote, not that there was a flood in Dubai that happens somewhere else and there's no flooding anywhere else, but show me the actual data for whatever extreme weather event you're predicting and show that it's come true. And the fact of the matter is, none of them have.
Thank you, James, Greg, and Steve, for your presentations, and to all those who joined. Again, thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.